public eye for a very long time in terms of the problems there. And the working group determined that Silver Springs needed to be restored in terms of its flow. The flow's been declining, and the nitrogen levels have been rising for years, and it was determined that it needed to be restored. And I got involved with the working group because I did my doctoral research through the University of Florida at Silver Springs in the 1970s. I actually went to Silver Springs in 1953 with my grandparents. I saw it before it was altered. My major professor in the 1970s was Howard Odom, who did the first study on Silver Springs in the 1950s. And so we have quantitative data, and when I went back and restudied it, and then I got to go back and restudy it again as a consultant for the St. Johns River Water Management District. In 2004 and 5, I did another annual full year study, detailed study of Silver Springs, and I was just shocked at how much it had changed in the 25 years since I'd done my study and 50 years since Dr. Odom had done his study. It was just, it's alarming if you don't know what the baseline is for these springs. And Silver Springs is still a beautiful place. It's actually, this year, it's had very high flows compared to the last 16 years because of high rainfall. Of course, the rainfall is directly related to spring flow. But that doesn't mean Silver Springs is out of the woods. And I had an op-ed in the Sunday paper in Gainesville Sun. I don't know, did they republish it down here? Okay, well, it's too bad. It's all about Silver Springs and what I saw. And basically, we found that I was out in the springs a couple of weeks ago, and we found that a lot of the algae had been blasted out of Silver Springs. It was for the Springs Fest that was recently held there. Anybody go to the Springs Fest? You know, there were like 7,000 people that went to the Springs Fest. It was really good turnout. But what I saw when we actually did a fish count right after the Springs Fest, and so we actually got to dive the river, and a lot of the algae was gone that had been there when I restudied Silver Springs in 2004 and 5. The algae was just gone, that it had really taken over Silver Springs. A lot of it, not all of it by any means, but that was a result of the high rainfall we've had the last year and a half, and nature basically trying to heal herself. But nature can only do so much because we're continuing to put a stress on Silver Springs by our groundwater use and our use of fertilizer and wastewater disposal. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about Silver Springs, give you a little bit of background. Most people have heard me give a number of lectures. I'll try not to duplicate any more than necessary, but I understand there's some new people in the room that may not know much about these problems, and so I'll try to appeal to everybody. And if you have any questions, you can interrupt me as I go, and I'll be glad to try to answer those. And this will probably only take about 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. Is it all right for me to take that much time, Chris? Is that all right? Okay, so we'll go and see if things work. I started the Springs Institute in 2010. The state of Florida had a Florida Springs initiative that started back in 2001, and a Springs Task Force that started in 1999 under Governor Jeb Bush. And it was recognized back in the 90s that the springs were starting to suffer, and so the state started putting some money into figuring out what was wrong so that they could figure out how to restore the springs. It all came to an end with Governor Rick Scott in 2011. He canceled there was 10 good years of work done under the Springs Initiative, and that's when I redid the study of Silver Springs in 2004 and 5. It was paid for by state money, and it was a collaborative effort between the St. Johns River Water Management District and the University of Florida. But that money just stopped flowing in 2011, and it was at that time that there was actually another group, Pete Colson and others, Pandion was the consulting company doing it. They were being paid by the state to prepare a restoration plan for Silver Springs. The contracts were pulled in 2011 when the Springs Initiative was stopped. There were 3-year contracts. I had the one for Ocala. I was doing the restoration plan for Ocala. The one for Silver, and there was one for Rainbow that was being done, both of those by Pandion. They both came to a stop. And so I started the Springs Institute around that time with the plan to fill in for what the state was no longer doing. And so that's where we started from. We've grown since then from just all volunteer labor to I actually have paid staff now. And we have scientists going out on a regular basis, studying springs, collecting data to basically do what the state did in the past. And we've developed restoration plans. I've got two things on the table. Chris, could you show those, the two documents next to you that you're welcome to take? One is a restoration plan executive summary for Silver Springs that I did right after that came to an end. I used the data that they had collected and put together a restoration plan. The other one is an overall springs conservation plan for the state of Florida. We have over 1,000 of these artesian springs in Florida, the biggest concentration any place in the world. And if you live in Marion County, you live in the epicenter of the springs country in Florida. The two biggest springs in the state are Silver and Rainbow. And but they're both in the process of dying. So coming to this meeting is important for you to maybe be part of the solution to these problems. They're not solved. The Springs Institute is part of that, and we take members for a nominal fee, and we get grants, and we are doing our best to protect springs. Our headquarters is in High Springs, a little town up in North Florida near Alachua. It's only about 10 minutes from the interstate at exit 399. And this is a mural we had painted on the side of our building after raising private funds. We had this mural painted. And this is really the gateway to the springs. Over 1 million people a year are passing our front door going to recreate in the springs every year. That's what the data show for Itchtucky Springs, Ginny Springs, Gilchrist Blue Spring, springs on the Swanee River. There are almost 300 springs in that area of the state. And so there's a lot more springs up there, but none are as large as the three that are in Marion County. Silver Glen, Silver, and Rainbow are the biggest ones. But nevertheless, that's where our little office is now. We're a very small outfit, but we actually have plans to build a full-scale, full-size Springs Center at Silver Springs, and we're working towards that. You're going to be hearing a lot from me in the next few years as I try to raise money for that effort. And the Alliance has already written us a letter of support, as many other organizations here in Ocala and Marion County have. And I'm going to do my very best to get that money raised and a building built out there where Wild Waters used to be. I studied under Howard Odom, who was the first one that started studying springs, and he came to the University of Florida in 1952 as a biology professor and looked around and said, what's neat about Florida? Well, the springs are the neatest thing here. There's no place else in the world where they have springs like Florida does. And so he put together a team of over 20 academic researchers to study Silver Springs on a very limited budget, $4,000 a year from the U.S. Navy, because they were interested in learning about scuba diving at the time. Wow. But anyway, he did a holistic, complete ecological study of Silver Springs in the 50s, and that is our best baseline now of the way the springs were in Florida. He also went out to 40 some other springs around the state, major springs, and became knowledgeable about them as well, and published some data on those. But Silver is the main one that's been studied before. And like I said, I was privileged to be his graduate student 25 years later and restudy Silver Springs. He was a prophet too. Although springs are the most constant aquatic environments in the world, they have a constant flow, they have constant water quality, they have a constant water clarity, and they have a constant temperature, as you all know, 72 degrees pretty much in this area. They are fragile, just like every other environmental attribute in Florida. Springs are the most limited, the smallest area of any kind of environmental system in Florida, and they're very fragile, just like any system. The spring dies if it has no water, obviously, and the spring dies also if you pollute the water or if you make the water tannic. And I can give you examples of many dying springs in Florida, in addition to the problems that are happening in Silver. So at his time, even in the 50s, springs were drying up. Kissington Spring was a very popular swimming hole in Polk County. It was a second magnitude spring, a large spring. Had hundreds of people swimming on weekends and playing in the spring. It dried up in the 1950s because the phosphate mining industry went into that area and basically pulled the water table down so far that the spring stopped flowing. Just stopped. And it's a dead spring now. Silver, this mightiest of all springs, the spring that has the highest flow of any spring in the world, started losing its flow around the 1980s. And since then, the flow has been going down. The long-term average flow has been declining in Silver Spring since the 1980s, and it no longer is the largest flowing spring in the state or in the world. Rainbow now actually has more flow than Silver. And Silver Springs that was blue in the past now turns green during years of lower flow. And the flow will get down to 1/5 of its historic average now during a dry year. And was getting low in 2017 until the horrific rain started back in June of 2017. And since then, the flow is up. And like I said, a lot of the algae has rinsed out. Silver Springs has been home to people as long as there have been people in Florida. We know that people were here for about 15,000 years prior to us. At the time they came, they hunted the mastodons and the horses and the giant cave bears and the giant ground sloths that were 28 feet tall. They hunted those animals and probably hunted them to extinction. So the weapons of those people, like this Clovis point and mastodon teeth, the mastodon remains are found in the Silver River. It was actually, the cave was occupied by people at one time, where they actually found artifacts down in the cave at Mammoth Cave. The water level was a lot lower at that time than the groundwater. Silver Springs wasn't flowing at that time, but it was home to these people. It's been home ever since for the last 15,000 years. It was a major source of commerce for Marion County. Ocala really wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Silver Springs. I mean, Fort King is where they settled to defend themselves from the Seminoles that lived here, or well, the Indians that lived here prior. But Fort King was located there because of its location related to Silver Springs, the biggest water supply in the area. So Silver Springs was a very convenient form of transportation, was to come up the St. Johns River from Jacksonville, come up the Ocala River, which is the principal, and Silver is the principal tributary for the Ocala, and then up Silver Springs, right to the spring, which basically puts you in Ocala, in East Ocala, if you will. And this is just a picture during that time. And this is starting in the 1850s. This became a major route for commerce in this area. And that was long before the railroads came in. And all they had was stagecoaches back then. If you can imagine doing a stagecoach ride through Florida, it must have been pretty bad. And then Silver Springs became the biggest attraction in the state. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, Silver Springs was the biggest tourist attraction in Florida all the way up in time until Disney came in. It was attracting over 1 million people a year as an attraction. And it's just because of its beauty and its majesty. People that came to Silver Springs that wrote about it in the 1800s described it as the grandest hydrographical feature in North America in comparison to the Mississippi River and Niagara Falls. I mean, that's the way it was being compared by northerners who were coming down here and seeing this whole river just leaping out of the ground. Day after day, there's this river there with water coming out of nowhere. It blows your mind if you really just take a moment to think about how unusual that is. And a lot of people hold springs sacred just because it's a miracle, that this water, this pure water is coming out of the ground day after day after day. We take it for granted, unfortunately, but that Disney really changed that, and there still was an attraction here until 2013 when the Palace Entertainment finally went down, and the state took over Silver Springs again because they owned it the whole time, a large part of that time while it was an attraction. And now it's experiencing a rebirth in terms of public use. I think we're up to probably 300,000 or 400,000 people a year coming to Silver Springs, and once we get our Springs Institute there and have a new welcome center and everything for it, I'm going to get us up to 1 million people a year. It doesn't hurt the spring to have 1 million people a year coming here. It helps it because then more people know just how valuable and important it is for the area. But it's still in harm, and it's in harm's way. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The state has not protected the groundwater in the area. They keep allowing pumping permits that are extracting more and more groundwater, which is lowering the level of the aquifer and lowering the flow in Silver Springs and Rainbow and all the other 1,000 springs in Florida. And they're all losing flow. And the other thing is we're using more and more nitrogen fertilizer, keeping more and more livestock, and we're polluting the water. We're polluting the water that is our drinking water. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but all the water in this room, all the water in Ocala essentially comes from the same place where Silver Springs gets its water, the Florida Aquifer. The limestone below our feet is a series of rivers that coalesce at Silver Springs. These are underground passageways. Cave divers have mapped out large areas and miles of these things. They come together at Silver Springs because that's where there's a limestone collapse, and that water can make its way to the surface of the ground. But that is the water that we use. All the well fields for Ocala, for Marion County, for Gainesville, for Jacksonville, for Tampa, all the way over to Crystal River, all the way out in the Panhandle, out past Mariana. All this water, in Orlando, all this water comes from the Florida Aquifer. And I'm going to tell you about that. Anyway, that's a lot of water, a lot of people using a lot of water. If you've seen anybody watering their lawns, probably have, watering their bean fields, whatever, that's water coming, that would have come out of the springs otherwise. In fact, the state does have a system for regulating how much water is used. It's called consumptive use permitting. And it says that for larger uses, you have to get a permit from the state. The water's free. The water is owned by everybody, and yet we give it away for free in permits to people. Like a water bottling plant can come in and apply for a permit and get $1 million a day worth of water for free. That's just the way the system works. It's crazy. We should be making people pay for the water. Everybody should pay, not just the people that live in cities. But we've given away now over 29,000 permits in this part of Florida that feeds the springs. And the springs are in the upper 2/3 of Florida. About 25 million acres of land is got fresh water in the aquifer and has springs. And it's these areas. There's 29,000 dots on this map. The red ones are in the St. Johns River Water Management District. The green ones are in the Southwest Florida Water Management District. The yellow ones are in the Swanee River District. And then there's more permits, but not nearly this density, over in the Northwest Florida Water Management District. But these permits right now, the best estimate is they're pulling somewhere over 2.5 billion gallons every day out of the Florida Aquifer, these permits. And these are just the permit withdrawals. These do not include several million private wells that are below the permit threshold. These are just permits that withdraw more than 100,000 gallons a day. In other words, each one of these permits is enough water for easily for 1,000 people, because an average person in Florida uses about 100 gallons per day total, irrigation and everything. And so every one of these permits for free is enough water for 1,000 people, and we give them away just like there's no tomorrow. And the state's still doing that. Silver's going to have a lot more given out before it stops, unless we rise up. The actual allocated amount of these permits is almost 5 billion gallons a day, or 4,630 million gallons a day. That's about half of the total recharge to the Florida Aquifer. In other words, that's half of the flow of all our springs in Florida. It's already permitted away, and we're still giving out permits. Yes, sir.
How much is actually used out of the permitted water?
Well, about 2.5 billion, 2.6, 2,622 is the estimate for pumping in 2010. It goes up and down each year, but it's somewhere, if you count Georgia too, it's about 3.5 billion gallons a day is already being used from the Florida Aquifer, which is over 30% of the flow of all the springs in the state. Yes, ma'am.
There's trucks carrying water throughout the county, really heavy trucks, putting stress on our roads, and probably we need to collect some money for them.
And the ironic thing is there are two very large wells in Silver Springs in the state park, not 100 feet from the park office there, right behind where the auto display used to be. There's two large wells that go to a private trust. These are individual people. That water is pumped under the road into that water tower that says Silver Springs on it. And there are trucks 24 hours a day coming in there and taking that water away. And it's being sold by that family to Zephyr Hills, Nestle, the other water bottlers. And that is going on right now. It's been going on for 20 years, and they've got a permit to keep doing it for essentially the next 10 or 20 years. It's insane what we do in this state. And if people just understood what we do, we wouldn't do it anymore, because the people that are allowing it would be in jail. These are the actual the actual pump amounts. This is actually pump data from this area of the state, put together by the U.S. Geological Survey. The biggest consumption of water from the Florida aquifer is in Polk County, and I told you where Kissington Springs and all the other springs on the Peace River has stopped flowing. That's the large circle down there. Agriculture is about half of that. The gray is the phosphate industry. The blue is just the domestic uses, public supply. Orlando is the next biggest circle. Over here, Orange County, 250 million gallons a day was in 2010. Jacksonville's the next. Tampa's the next. And well, Hillsborough and Pasco counties are obviously a very large use together. What that has done is led to a drawdown in the Florida aquifer, and it's the height of water in the aquifer and the elevation of the spring, the hole, where the spring is just a hole in the ground. Okay, if there's no water in the aquifer, there's no water coming out of the spring. It's like a hole in the side of a bucket. You have to fill the bucket up above the hole for water to start coming out of it. And so the amount of water that comes out of that hole or out of that spring has to do with how high that level of water is in the bucket or in the aquifer. And Silver Springs, you can see how it started declining in flow. It goes up, the points are annual averages up and down for Silver and for Rainbow. And somebody said I had a point. And so these are annual averages. So there's a lot of variation in flow based on rainfall. But up through the 60s, actually it rained a lot in the 60s here. And up until that time, Silver was flowing over 800 cubic feet per second, which is about 500 million gallons a day, about 1/2 billion gallons a day. And that really started declining by the 1980s. Silver always had been bigger, about 70, 80 million cubic feet per second than Rainbow, having a higher flow, and then that crossed in the 1990s, and Silver is going down, down, down in terms of its flow, the long-term average flows.